everybody, and welcome. We have a few people in here. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our topic is protecting your startup against fraud, and we have people who understand the length, the breadth, everything there is to know about this. But I'm going to hand off now to our veritable moderator who is going to introduce the panelists and everybody else. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Motorola Bisia Folabi. Woohoo!
Thank you very much, Toba. Hi, everyone. So welcome to this webinar on startup security and a guide to fraud prevention for your startups. My name is Motorola Bisia Folabi. I am a legal and regulatory counsel at Paystack, and I'm joined here with my friends from Smile. So we're just going to go around and just let everyone know who we're speaking with. So we can start with the Paystack team. So I'll allow Jemima and Ingrid introduce themselves also.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima. I am the Operations and Risk Product Lead at Paystack. I'm super excited for this conversation today.
Hi, I'm Ingrid, the Customer Success Manager at Paystack. So I handle all onboarding and fraud-related stuff here.
Okay. And now our friends from Smile can go.
Great, I'll kick off. So hi, everybody. My name is Dustin, and I head up account management at Smile ID. For those that aren't aware, Smile ID is a digital identity verification business. So we work with lots of startups all the way through to enterprise clients to help them with their onboarding journey, to help them catch fraud at the onboarding phase, and really to make that process as seamless as possible. And my job is really to talk to a lot of those customers on a daily basis. So really understand their challenges and help them solve them.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Okwe. I'm the founding product manager with Smile. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So we're just going to get right into it. This is going to be a very engaging and informative session. So I'm just going to ask our lovely guests some questions so we can just get the ball rolling. So I have always believed that to win as a startup in the long term, you need to spend more time on the hard, crunchy, regulatory compliance stuff. And that ends up being the competitive advantage in the long run. So my question is for the Paystack team. So at Paystack, we have a very robust KYC reviews process just to ensure that only legitimate merchants are onboarded. So for the benefit of our listeners, I mean, some might be startups. What are some of the best practices that we have implemented in successfully combating fraud and ensuring consumer safety?
I'll take that. So I have a long list of best practices, but I'll narrow it down to obviously what's doable. So like Tunu said, so the one thing that we notice is as a startup, like initially, like compliance and regulatory requirements were not like part of the core. And then you find yourself playing catch up because once you grow as a startup, you start dealing with regulatory fines, you start having audits and all those things. So it's important that you create a culture like that in the beginning. So the handful of things that we focus on or that we looked at is understanding your market. So what are those legislative requirements within that particular market? So regardless of where you are, what are the laws, what are the rules? And if you can't do that in-house, obviously you can always get a consultant to, list out what are those KYC requirements and understanding like what does the law require me to do as a startup, and obviously like how am I going to apply that. The other one is obviously onboarding is very, very important. So try and integrate the onboarding process with obviously the legal requirement, right? So don't say like my customers should just put an email and then suddenly they have like a business live transacting and stuff like that. So that's also very, very important, right? So throughout the onboarding process, even when you start, let your customers get used to the idea that your organization is compliant, even though it's a startup. And then the other one is, I'm sure the Smile team will smile. Make sure you have a verification partner. We all know that there's a lot of identity theft. We all know that people may use people's other information to use your platform as a way of money laundering, fraud, like all of those elements. So it's important to get a verification partner that helps you identify that if a person gave me this document, right, are they the actual person on obviously the national or government databases? And then at Paystack, what we also do is just to make sure that the particular ID and verification match, because we do have photos from Smile ID. We also have to make sure that the bank accounts belong to that particular person, right? So it's not enough that you get Tunri's ID document and verify it, but then you need to understand, like, am I actually paying Tunri for her services, or is she using our platform, right? And is she still the same person that we're sending the money to, right? So in a nutshell, the flow of funds. So when your money comes in and it goes out, what does that look like? And regulators like that, understanding, like, how do you verify your people? How do you know they are who they are? And then still a long list, but I'll give you guys two more. The other one is understand your customers, right? So there's product risk. So what product are you actually offering? What does it look like? And then understand, like, your customers and behaviors, and then do like a small risk analysis, right? To say, okay, fine, how can my product be used or leveraged for fraud or any other, weird things that people do in this market, right? And then so focus on that. And then the last one is, as part of your onboarding process, right, you always need to do sanction screening alongside with obviously the Smile ID verification. And the reason for that, I mean, the documents are public, they are on public databases. So you could download that if you don't want to, pay a partner to do it in the beginning. And just make sure that you search for every customer's name, to just make sure they're not on a sanctions list, or they were not arrested at some point for fraud and other weird things in the past. And yeah, I think that is a small description of what we do at Paystack that actually helps us prevent fraud from onboarding.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That's very insightful. I'm sure so many people have learned from that very detailed answer. The next question, this one is for our Smile team. So could you also share some common practices and ID verification tools that startups should be aware of to proactively identify and deter fraudsters?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think a good place to start there is just to understand some of the common fraud types that are typically experienced across, or at least what we see. I mean, we've processed over 75 million KYC checks across the African continent. So we have a really large data set that can kind of show us what types of fraud are typically coming through, and then obviously how we look to mitigate against those fraud aspects. So although if you kind of do a bit of searching online and you have a look at what's going on from an AI perspective these days, you might get a big fright when you start seeing how people are able to use things like deep fakes to provide sort of particular avatars that look like somebody else, and you have to start thinking about how that can be used creatively to actually to fraudulently access accounts. Important also to recognize that what we see as the most common fraud types currently in Africa are still very unsophisticated, right? So most of the time it's someone that's stolen your ID number or stolen your ID book, and then they're trying to onboard with that. Okay, and I'll speak to ways that you can mitigate against that in just a bit. But then further to that, you then have people trying to use selfie spoofs, right? So when you start introducing things like selfie checks, people will try and use a photo of a photo, or a cardboard cutout with a photo pasted on that, and try and take the selfie that way. And then that gets more and more sophisticated, and you start getting to things like deep fakes and that sort of thing. We see very, very limited cases of things like deep fakes and that type of thing across the African continent. However, important to recognize that when you're thinking about tools, you need to ensure that those types of fraud vectors are taken care of as well. So how do you mitigate against these from a tools perspective? Number one, you've obviously got to have what we call a liveness detection algorithm in terms of what you're doing. And really what that does is that proves that there's a real human being behind the device. So Ope can speak better than I am about like the technical aspect of how that will all come together, and I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But effectively, you want to make sure that there's a real human being behind the device first and foremost. Secondly, you want to try wherever possible to verify that person's selfie that they take or an image that they take against a reliable source of truth. And there's a number of sources of truth that you can use. And that's kind of the third tool, is like ensuring that whether you work with a provider or you're looking to build your KYC flow out yourself, you're accessing reliable sources of truth to do the verification against, right? So that's either a photo of a government issued ID document, and what you're adding to that is sort of forensic authentication of that document. You want to make sure that you've got tools in place that can actually provide comfort that that is a legitimate document that you're comparing against. Or alternatively, and another good source of access is government ID authority databases, right? So a number of key markets across Africa, there are government organizations that provide access to a digital source of identity. And in most cases, or in many cases at least, those records also have photos on file, and you're able to do comparisons against those types of things. So that extends further into verifying the ID number, things like date of birth, name and surname, and those are quite basic. But that sort of full plethora is kind of the extent of the tools that you would look to use to ensure that a person is who they say they are. You can then extend that further, and like Ingrid said, leverage things like checks against global sanctions lists, politically exposed persons list, adverse media lists, and that type of thing. And then another thing that we see a lot of fraud of is what we call duplicate fraud. And really it's people that are kind of fraudulently able to basically access or take on multiple accounts on various customers' accounts using the same face potentially. So always important, depending on the market that you're operating in, to understand that those types of fraud elements exist, and use tools like we have, which is a tool called Smile Secure, which actually identifies duplicate selfies in your process and is able to flag those for you to take full action against them at the onboarding phase.
Thank you very much, Dustin, for that very insightful answer. And this is just a follow-up to that. So, I mean, as we know, balancing security with user experience is something that's really crucial. So how can startups strike a balance between providing a seamless onboarding experience for genuine users and also implementing these effective measures that you have identified?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Terry. Yeah, so like Dustin clearly outlined, right, there are a bunch of different fraudulent vectors or attack vectors that we see in the market. And you sort of like want to, as rightly said, balance how you check all of those things or track them or catch those type of like fraud attacks against having a seamless user experience. So there are a couple of good practices that you can sort of like implement on your side, and can just go through a few of them. I think one of the most important ones is probably going to be progressive profiling. So what that essentially means is, as you're opening up like accounts for your users, you want to ensure that you only ask for what you need, as at when you need them. And you want to balance that with sort of like the risk involved at different tiers, right? So if someone is going to come on board your system, for example, and then you want to open like a low tier account for them, just ensure that you can only perform low risk transactions. And then you only ask for documents or information that they need at that level. The other piece is like just providing clear instructions, right? So that also cannot be overemphasized, right? Because what you want to do, or what we see a lot of, right, in our market is sometimes when you get to like the middle of an onboarding process, you realize that, oh snap, looks like they need this particular detail from me. let's say some form of ID, and I don't have any on me, right? So we tend to see like drop-offs happening at that point. So just providing a clear instruction of these are all the set of like details you need to provide as you go through like this onboarding process is always great. The next piece, and as Dustin mentioned, is you can leverage a lot of like source of truths to populate like the profile of your user, right? So whether that is information on a document or an ID authority database, right? So rather than asking someone to fill 1,001 different form fields, right? You can get most of the things you need or the critical pieces of information from ID document, government issued ID document, or from the ID authority database themselves. And then to reduce again the amount of information you need to get, you can leverage things like facial biometrics, right, to compare the users, like to essentially prove ownership of the ID information that you're retrieving, right, or the image of the document itself. So you can ask the user for their selfie, right, as an example, and an ID information, and then you just get all the rest of the fields you need, like their names, date of birth, and all of that. And for some of like our other partners as well, or customers, or what we've seen in the market, people want to, like I mentioned, issue like low-level accounts, right? What you can also do is to essentially perform knowledge-based checks, right, on the back end. So you want to ask the user for some source of truth, say an ID number that you can run checks on the back end rather than them filling out the entire information. Let's say they are doing a feature-based phone onboarding. And then you can ask them for some numerical value that you expect them to know, say like their year of birth, date of birth or something. And then you compare that with information you retrieved to open a low-level account for the user. So those are some of like the best practices that we've seen that essentially like doesn't cannibalize too much on user experience while ensuring that like you're on the right side of the regulator, and also you're still catching like the fraudulent or they're sieving out like fraudulent or bad actors. And maybe the advantage, just the additional pieces, the advantage of adding biometrics is further down the user journey, then you can now do things like risk-based authentication, right? Where you can ask the user for a selfie for transactions that are out of their typical behavior. Let's say they are trying to send or transfer like a higher amount than they usually transact with on the app, or they're trying to perform remittance for the very first time on your app if you're like a remittance business, or they're trying to get additional loans, right? So you can then use like facial biometrics to perform like risk-based authentication just to ensure that it's actually still the user that you're interacting with.
Maybe if I can just add to that as well. I mean, perfectly put. And what I'd love to do is just kind of give the folks that are starting this journey a little bit of advice, right? And I would say just do extensive due diligence on your market and your users, because it's important to recognize that KYC at the onboarding phase is effectively the gatekeeper to your product or your service, right? So if you get it, obviously getting it right is essential because you want to stop fraudsters. But if you get it wrong, you risk a number of very good users that don't go through your onboarding flow. And that's where you spent lots and lots of your kind of hard-earned marketing dollars to put that to work to acquire customers. And really you have to manage that balance very carefully. And that's why we put a lot of work into designing our solution in such a way that you can do that, and you can kind of achieve multi-tiers of onboarding, and you can do it at the right stage in your journey. So really understand what your users are trying to get out of your product or service, and the user experience that goes around that, and match that to your provider. Make sure that the types of devices that your users are onboarding with is supported by your providers. And if you're trying to do very detailed checks, that the devices that are typically used by your users actually can cater for that, right? So just spend a lot of time on the user experience and match that to what you're trying to achieve from an onboarding perspective would be my advice.
Those are very, very useful insights. So thanks, Okwai, thanks, Dustin. Particularly your point on spending enough time on the user experience. So I'm sure that's one that our listeners have found very useful. So back to the Paystack team. My question is, so how do different departments such as risk, reviews, compliance, and product, as we know, it takes a village. So how do all these departments collaborate in combating fraud within a startup? Are there specific strategies that have proven effective in just aligning all these different departments' efforts?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I think there are very many different strategies that you can adopt as a team. I think something that's worked really well at Paystack is our fraud risk team is a very cross-functional team. So it comprises of people from the reviews team, the disputes team, the compliance team. And I think the value that that creates is you're able to inform both product and strategy decisions that relate to fraud risk from a holistic perspective. So that's throughout the merchant lifecycle, from at the point you're onboarding them to what their transactional activity looks like at Paystack, to the point of offboarding if that's required. Having said that, I would like to say that I do believe in every organization, everyone is a risk owner. So risk decisions shouldn't be made in isolation with the risk teams. It's also important to empower every member of your organization to make risk considerations in whatever decisions that they're owning. Some of the ways that that can be done that we've also applied at Paystack is we have product risk assessments. So before a product is launched, you're supposed to look through the potential risks that could be associated with that product and verify that there are adequate controls in place to be able to launch. I think for growth stage startups, something that could be explored if your team is big enough is having embedded product teams where you have risk managers sitting with your product team so that even from the point of product ideation, risk considerations are being actively made to inform the solution that is derived at the end of the day. And I also think that if you're a smaller startup team, it can even be having an informal session. So getting all the right heads in a room and doing a pre-mortem and thinking through what are all the things that could go wrong if we went live with this tomorrow. To Dustin and Oppa's point, as a startup, it is very important to invest in your risk controls because one risk incident could be detrimental to your business. So making sure that you're taking that as seriously as possible and the considerations are being made is something that should be done. And also to add on to some of the things that have been mentioned previously, if risk isn't your core competence as a business, it's okay to outsource and it's okay to partner with a Smile ID or a screening provider to ensure that you get it right. I'm sure that there are cost implications that come with that might be difficult as a startup or a growth stage company, but there are also ways to partner. I know at Paystack, we have our startup programs where you're able to get discounted access to third-party tools. So I think there are ways to navigate it so you're able to scale your business, to test out your product market fits, validation ideas without exposing yourself to too much risk. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jemima. That was very useful. I'm sure a lot of people listening found that also very insightful as well, especially the point about if risk is in your core competency, it's okay to outsource this. I think that's something a lot of people are going to think about more clearly after this. So the next question is for the Smile team. We've been talking about compliance. So what role does regulatory compliance play in shaping your verification processes? So how does your identity verification solution ensure compliance with existing regulations?
Yeah, cool. Let me take that one. So I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize why you're doing identity verification or KYC in the first place. So typically, there's generally two reasons why you do that. Number one, the obvious one is to stop fraud. But number two, often you're regulated to do that, right? So if you're a company that's providing financial services, chances are in the entity, in the country that you're operating in, you're a regulated entity, and there's legislation that requires you to actually do KYC and actually perform certain checks to ensure that you know who's onboarding onto your system. So obviously, first and foremost, our tool set allows that verification, and it allows you to customize the types of verifications you're doing based on the regulation that exists within the country that you operate in. The other very, very important thing to recognize when you're doing verifications, typically against sources of truth, you will likely be processing or storing personal identifiable information. So data protection becomes incredibly important. All the regulation that goes around that is very important to ensure that you're compliant with that. From our perspective, we very much operate as a data processor. And so the very important thing I want to highlight there is we typically are processing data on behalf of our clients. We have very robust measures to ensure that we're compliant with all data protection regulation around that in the various regions that we operate in. And we have certain retention periods that we keep data for, and then we have robust processes to scrub that data. But the more important factor to recognize is ultimately clients that we're typically performing these verifications on behalf of, they are regulated and they have certain responsibilities in terms of the regulation that they operate in. So yes, it's a great option to outsource your verifications to third-party providers, but you must also bear in mind that you can't outsource your responsibility in terms of the regulation that you are bound by, and that's a key aspect. In terms of data access, I mean, we deal extensively with regulators that are constantly looking at ways that you can access sources of truth in order to do your verifications against, and there are constant changes in those regulations. So we have experts in most regions across Africa that engage with these regulators. We proactively understand what potential changes might be coming down the line, and we really help to change our products as and when they need to change and improve them to cater for all of these regulatory changes, and also to advise our clients when these changes take place. So it's very much an essential and huge part of what we do on a day-to-day basis at Smile.
Thank you very much for that answer. And just for the benefit of our listeners, could you elaborate a bit more on some of these measures that your company takes to secure user data during the verification process? So essentially, what are some of these measures you use in ensuring the privacy and safety of the users?
All right. Yeah, Dustin, I think I'll just undo that one. Yeah, so the first one, like as Dustin mentioned, is we are data processors, right? And what that means is we don't store user information in perpetuity. We have like an agreed number of days, which is like the retention period that we store the information for. So we are in no way like a system of record. In addition to that, we also have like all of our API calls, right? And like are essentially signed. So what that means is it's not just like an open-ended API that anyone can just call or that you can just hijack. We also encrypt like our data, right, at rest and in transit. So even if you hijack it, you won't be able to decode like the information, right, that is being sent. In addition to that, like access across all of the systems, both internal and like for our partners are secured. So like for our partners on our portal, we have 2FA, two-factor authentication. So apart from just the password, you also need to have like an authentication app somewhere on you to just confirm that you're really the one that wants to gain access. And then for us internally, access is like least privileged based, right? So what that means is you only get access to what you need to have access to, right? So you don't just get to see everything. And then from like the system architecture as well, we ensure that everything is strongly siloed. So what that means is if partner A is using our system to run like KYC verifications, partner B is not going to be able to see any of those information, right? And for our environment as well, production environments, which is where actual user information is flowing through, right, as like a higher level of restriction, as opposed to like our sandbox environment, which doesn't have any real user information or details. And like for all of like these checks and tests we've done, everything has also been audited. So we are ISO 27001 certified, right? We also have like our SOC 2 Type 2 certification, which essentially just shows that like we are handling like the information in the best way possible. And the final piece to all of that is from like the end user perspective as well. Since we are data processors, we always advise like our partners to show consent screens, right, to their end users, which just clearly states that these are like the set of information I'll be collecting from like some source of truth, right, on your behalf that I'll be using before I can render a service to you, right? And these are like the set of like processors that I'm going to be sending your information to. So we work with our partners just to ensure that they have like consent screens and users are clear on what information they are collecting about them and what those information are being used for.
Thank you very much. I picked up on something you said, which was in your sandbox environment and not having user details. Do you want to elaborate more on that point?
Yes. So sort of like best practice is you need to have like a sandbox environment that doesn't hold any real user information, but your end users or even you yourself, let's say you're evaluating a new KYC provider or whatnot, or you're trying to add like a third-party service, you need to have like a sandbox environment that doesn't hold any real user data that people have access to. And you can sort of like check the different scenarios and edge cases, right, that might happen as you're rolling out the service. So for us, like in our test data, we provide things like test IDs, right? So for anybody trying to integrate into our system, they get like test IDs. You can call those like 1 million times. It really doesn't matter. And each of those test IDs talk to different scenarios that could happen, right? Like what does something being marked for fraud, for example, what does that response look like? What does it look like if everything is fine and it's successful? What sort of like personal information do I get back, and stuff like that? So we send all those information back to the partner and they can use that to integrate like our service. And it's also best practice for any other like third-party service you want to integrate to just do it in your sandbox environment.
That's really, really great. There's so many insights, so many keys and tools from this. My next question is for the Paystack team, and this is for some startups that are listening. So in what ways can startups update their onboarding processes to stay ahead of fraud threats? So are there certain indicators or benchmarks that suggest it's time to revisit and revise the existing procedures?
Yeah, so I think that one is a bit tricky depending on obviously what stage you are, as a startup, right? So at Paystack, we trust our data, and I think that's like the very, very important element, right? So there's regulatory requirements, there's things that we put in place to make sure that obviously we have the right information and we try to prevent fraud. But then the longer you go, it's like fraud is inevitable, right? It's just like what proactive measures do you normally take, to ensure that when it happens, you understand what those causes were, what are those patterns, right? So if you don't have data, there's a lot of news articles about like fraud patterns that are happening within, countries, and then like the FICs, so the financial intelligence centers within a specific country, will have come up with like articles or research on like in the past year, these are the amount of fraud that happened, these are the types of fraud, these are the markets, and this is how it happened, right? So those are the specific things that you need to look out for. And then obviously when legislation starts to change, you need to understand or try and understand why, right? So let's use an example. In Nigeria, now to be a lending business, you need like extra layers that were not there before, right? I need to try and understand like what caused those layers, what were those particular changes, and that's where the law will sort of help you with that. But then at the same time, look at news, look at patterns, and also look at customer reviews, right? So before your merchant even onboards, like look at like what are the customers saying about this particular person, and how long has this person, been like in business, in quotation mark, what products are they selling? And if you look at all the information they've provided, I mean, let's say a person says they sell cars, but then when you look at their address, they are like in a residential area with like 10 apartment blocks. Like, literally speaking, does that make any sense, right? So there's so many things that you can do on a day-to-day basis to help you align with those things. And then obviously newsletters and research papers that come out from the financial institutions, or if I mean, even banks issue those things, right? Look at those, and then obviously once legislation starts changing, look at what markets they're focusing on the most and try and understand like what is that particular issue. And on top of that, I would say use something, I don't know, it's different within different jurisdictions, but just use the risk-based approach. But it's sort of, you can use it as an element of onboarding, but then after onboarding, throughout your customer cycle, look at like, where's the risk? Where am I seeing the most risk? And then put the most resources there, because you don't want to keep checking every single merchant and running after false positives while not looking at, where the core problem lies, right? So look at where the losses are the most, where the customers have complained the most, which merchants you've actually offboarded because of obviously fraudulent behavior, and then look at the common patterns between those, and see if there's anything that you as an organization can use. And then I think it's also going to differ depending on the product that you offer. So I think it shouldn't be like one blanket, a blanket approach, because if you offer investment services as a startup, there'll be different types of fraud, there'll be different patterns. If you offer, let's say, I don't know, savings, there'll be different types of fraud and different. So look at your product, understand your product, look at the market, and then look at the law. I think that is enough. Yes.
So that's very, very useful. I love the point about checking patterns and threads in the common patterns when you're examining these issues, and of course, looking at the law for obvious reasons.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that. So to Ingrid's point, I do believe data is king because it helps you understand your customer. It helps you identify the risks that are posed to your business, as it may vary based on the industry that you're in as a startup. But I think something that she touched on that's very important is onboarding controls are key, but you also need to ensure that you are assessing risk throughout your customer's life cycle with your business. Also to ensure that, because risk evolves over time, like you'll see different trends, it's very important to consistently invest in the risk controls that you have in place as a business. Beyond leveraging the information you already have and financial resources, you could also have external audit assessments done, or even internal audit assessments if you do have those teams already, just to be able to make sure that you are actually putting the right controls in place based on the risks that are imminent to your business or that are relevant to your business. So that's another way of getting visibility into some of the risks that you may have. Also, based on the risk that the customer poses, if it is a higher risk customer, some level of enhanced due diligence is required. So that might be an area where you might have to have more consistent reviews as opposed to a customer that may be low risk. So there are ways that you can use a risk-based approach that Ingrid alluded to inform the frequency of reviews that are required for your customers and your risk controls.
Thank you very much, Jemima. Again, this is a lot of key information, and I'm sure our listeners are finding this very vital. So I have another question for the Smile team, and this is, so what are the innovative technologies or methods that Smile is employing to enhance identity verification and prevent fraud? For example, how does Smile leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence in fraud detection and prevention?
All right. Anybody can start off with that one, then Dustin can add anything if you want. So on our end, right, I think first piece is we have a proprietary machine learning technology, right? So we've built out different models and algorithms that can do three main things, which I think Dustin also mentioned earlier. It's like face comparison, right? So answer like, does like these two faces match, right? To put it simply. Next is like liveness checks, right? So just to confirm or to answer, is this person actually in front of like this camera at the point of them taking this picture? And then the third piece is like spoof detection, right? Which is now we're taking a look at an image and then trying to answer whether or not someone is trying to spoof the system. And we do see like different variations of that, like Dustin mentioned. We've not really been seeing things like deep fakes and all of that in our markets, but we see things like people doing cardboard cutouts, right? People trying to take a picture of another picture on the screen, like a replay attack, and things like that, or trying to like take people's pictures unaware, right? And all of that. So we see a bunch of those, and we consistently like build models to catch different types of spoof attacks, to also like improve our liveness detection, and finally like for like face comparison. And we have to build like this proprietary technology, keeping in mind like the limited infrastructure we have in the market, right? So for example, for most of like our checks, we don't do things like video confirmation to do liveness detection, right? Because you can imagine trying to send 10 megs worth of file using like a 3G network, right? So not everybody has like access to fast enough internet in our market. The other piece is like we need to like essentially build out these models, keeping in mind that not everybody has $1,000 like iPhone, right, to take a picture. Some are using like low-end Android devices that don't have like as great cameras, right, as others. So it's now like building models that can work with even low quality pictures. And the other aspect of it, as Dustin mentioned, is now like on our document checks itself, right? So doing some level of verification that the document is actually genuine, right? And then also leveraging like the face comparison to ensure like the document actually belongs to the person, right? And finally, like optical character recognition or extracting information from the document and sending all of those back to the partner. So those are some of like the technologies that we've employed internally. And then there are like has been variations of those tech as well. So as Dustin mentioned, we have like the Smile Secure product, which essentially does like face comparison at scale, right? It's like it's essentially asking the question, have we seen Okwe before, right? Is this Okwe's 10th account or 15th account, right? So you can use that for things like prevent loan stacking fraud, right? Like people trying to open multiple accounts if you only want them to have a single account, and stuff like that. Yeah, so those are like technology. It's mostly been face biometrics related technology, but then now adding the nuances of our market, right? And also adding things like working based on like African faces, and all of that.
Thank you very much. That's very insightful. The entire session has just been so useful. I mean, so just a lot of useful information from so many experts in their field. So I'm sure like all the listeners here are really, really benefiting from this. And like we said, we're going to take some questions from the listeners. So if you are online, you can see a place at the bottom that says questions. So you can actually tap on there and ask questions. So we've already had a few. So there's a question here from Roger Norton, and it's for Smile. So it says, does Smile share fraud information from one customer with all their other customers?
So I can take that. So short answer there is no, we don't. So we perform verifications specifically in real time against a source of truth, right? So we don't hold kind of fraudulent lists or anything like that we refer against. We do things like sanctions and PEP checks and that type of thing, where we actually refer to third-party lists where fraudulent users might be part of those lists, and where we enable verification of your users against those lists. But we don't store any kind of lists of known fraudsters or anything like that.
Okay, thank you very much. That
Sorry.
answers it.
Tony, can I just add something there? So
Sure.
with regards to, obviously, it says declared and wanted by law enforcement agencies. That is a lot of adverse media, searches. So even though Smile doesn't hold it, there are a lot of platforms that do a lot of adverse media related searches, right? So the name, the surname, they even tell you exactly what this person did when they did it. So I think those can be leveraged as well.
Thank you very much. I think we've answered all the current questions. Okay, there's another one. It says, is it illegal to store fraudsters' information?
Maybe like I can take that one. So my goodness, to answer your question, so it's not illegal to store like fraudsters' information. I mean, it depends on what type of entity or company you are, right? So like I mentioned earlier, we, for example, are data processors. And what that means in like data protection regulation is we are not allowed to store like customer data in perpetuity, right? But you as like the data controller, right? Like let's say you're directly accessing end users or providing services to end users directly. You can store information of like your customers and fraudsters as well, right? And then run like your list against or like new onboarding, for example, against that list. What I would also add is I know there is like a whole lot of like conversations happening in different markets, right, across Africa right now. So fintechs, for example, in Nigeria are discussing how to essentially create a central, like a fraudster network, right? And then house that with the right regulatory agency so they can add like some regulatory back into it and then call in law enforcement if they ever need to and things like that. So there are those conversations happening. The short answer is you can store it if you're a data controller, right? And you do have like the consent from the user to store their information. If you want to add like some law enforcement action and regulatory action, so that there are like rules and all of that that you have to follow, like CBN and all these other regulators dictate like rules on what you do with fraudsters and where you report it and all of that.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. There's another question, and we touched on this during the session when we talked about data protection. But if you could go over this again, someone wants to know, how do you use your clients' data?
Right. So for us, we are data processors. So what that means is we don't store the end user information, right? We only store it for the particular like retention period that we have agreement to. Maybe the only caveat on that is we do have a product called authentication, biometric authentication. What that essentially means is, let's say Motrayo has access to your service, YAO, for example, and then Motrayo wants to collect, like, let's say you give loans and she decides to collect like a higher loan amount, right, after repaying the first one. Rather than ask Motrayo for all of our KYC information again, you could essentially just ask for a selfie, right? And then we can compare that with the initial selfie Motrayo submitted during onboarding. So you can just confirm that she's actually the one rather than running like a full KYC check and then reuse like the same data. And it's not like identity theft and all of that. So for us, we only store the information based off of agreement with the partner, after which we delete it from the system. And we only keep like metadata just to show evidence that you actually performed the job. Things like whether the job was successful, how much it cost, right, when it was performed and all of that, but nothing that can be used to trace the end user.
Okay. Thank you very much. And for the audience, people listening, just know you can still ask questions. At the bottom of the screen, you see a part that says questions. So this is your chance to learn from these experts. But in the meantime, as we wait for more questions, I'll just ask Smile ID one more question, which is, as we know, and we've probably, we've identified along the way, startups have very unique needs. So how customizable is your identity verification solution? How does it cater to the specific requirements for different startups?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that, and I'm sure Ope can probably add a lot more from a product standpoint. But I think we've tried to spend a great deal of time making our product as kind of integration as agnostic as possible, right? So not just that we've spent a lot of time ensuring that no matter what platform you're using, no matter what channel your users are generally trying to access your product or service, we have an option to allow you to verify that user in a robust manner that is able to pick up fraud and also enable to get you a level of success that goes through your funnel that's of a significantly high level. Right, so that's the one side of things, but then we also have the ability to almost build out your particular user journey based on your risk-based approach, right? And I think Ingrid mentioned having a risk-based approach, and we also recommend doing the same thing. And really what that means is a different, based on different products that you might have. You might have a number of different products within your ecosystem that you want to provide, products or services, and each of those may have a different risk profile associated with it. So what that means is you'll need to provide different KYC verifications for each of those products, and we give you the tool set to do that. So we've been very deliberate about doing that because we know that all of our clients have different needs. All of our clients have different risk-based approaches. A lot of them operate in different jurisdictions from a geographical perspective, and each of those geographical regions potentially has different regulations and requirements that they need to verify against. So we spent a lot of time and effort, and I'm sure Ope has had many sleepless nights trying to ensure that we're able to provide our product and the access to that product to as many different permutations as are possible within the continent, but also within various industries that we operate in.
Yeah, and maybe just to add one more thing to what Dustin mentioned, he has like outlined it clearly. We recently also launched a no-code option, which we call like Smile Links. So for startups that are very lean, don't have like enough engineering resources like to integrate a KYC provider, you could easily just generate like KYC links via the portal. That's also available via an API. It's fully hosted by us, right? And then you can share those links with your end user so they can perform like the KYC verification you need them to. And the results will be available on the portal or via a callback if you have someone to integrate. So that's like a get started quickly sort of like option for people that are very lean teams.
And just add one last thing to that. We also give our clients the option through certain integration methods to actually match the look and feel of the selfie capturing screens and the document capturing screens to the look and feel of your application. If you've built out your own mobile app, for example, there's a number of things that you can do to kind of match that look and feel so that it looks like a seamless experience to your customers, which is obviously crucial in terms of a seamless user experience, which I think most people are after these days.
Okay, thank you very much. The Smile ID team, it's been such an amazing session with so many insights. We have one more question from the audience. So the question is from Adi Damala, and it says, we've seen cases where tech companies use customer phone numbers while onboarding as a form of identification/verification, but get to use it for another service when they tweak their business model without customer consent. Is this not a data protection issue? And what can customers do in this regard?
Right. Yeah, so, I mean, it can be a data protection issue. I think it depends on what the tech company or the business, right, stated as the reason why they are collecting the phone number, right? So for some people, they put it like right there in blueprint, like would also use this to provide XYZ other services, right? And best practice, give them the option to opt out of the things that are not essential, right? It's very difficult for customers to really do anything about it. In this case, it's more of like the regulators that have to do stuff about it. And what we've seen as well is there are different data protection laws and regulations that are coming into full force, mostly following like what's in the GDPR, right? So if you go read like those acts and those laws, there are things like auditors come in to check what you're actually using customer data for, sanctions that will be applied if you are doing anything that is outside of the law, right? So there are things that like government agencies are doing about it, right? To sort of like ensure people are not being funny, right, with like customer data. But you can get out of that by just putting it in blueprint and making it clear to your customer that this is what I'll be using your information for, and giving them the option to opt out.
All right, thank you. I don't know if Jemima wanted to add something to that.
Oh, he covered what I wanted to say.
Oh, okay, okay, great. So I think that's all we have. I don't know if you're in the audience and you still have a question, feel free to pop it. But I think for now, that's all we have. Thank you very much. The Paystack team that's been here, Jemima, Ingrid, you guys have been amazing. And of course, our friends, the Smile ID team, this was so useful. And we hope everyone else has had a great time, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the day. So thank you.